Yeah, today is 12th June, and we learn that late last night, on Tuesday, 11th June, late in the night, Vladimir Putin held a council of war. We're not actually even told where the location of this event took place, but the Kremlin website has confirmed that it happened. The report of this meeting by the Kremlin website is extremely brief, but I will read it out. Meeting with Defense Minister, Chief of the General Staff and military district commanders. Late on Tuesday night, Vladimir Putin met with Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, Chief of the General Staff and First Deputy Defense Minister Valery Gerasimov, and military district commanders. Those present at the meeting reported to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on the progress of the special military operation and plans for continued action. After the general consultation, the President heard the participants' reports and held several one-to-one meetings. That's all the Kremlin is telling us. As I said, they don't tell us where this meeting took place, whether it happened in the Kremlin or in the Defense Ministry or in Rostov, where the overall command headquarters of the forces, the military forces that are conducting the special military operation, are located. We are simply told that this meeting took place and that the participants in the meeting briefed Putin on the progress of the special military operation and plans for continued action. And it's the last words, plans for continued action, which perhaps we should underline and take particular note of. Because as I have been saying for several weeks now, the tempo of Russian military operations in the conflict in Ukraine is intensifying, and we seem to be increasingly close to a pivot point. Now, to get a sense of how intense the fighting has become and how intense the pressure that the Russians are placing on the Ukrainians is, we can go to the two latest briefings of the Russian Defense Ministry. The one that they provided on the 11th of June, yesterday, and the one that they provided today, just before I made this program, that is to say on 12th June. On 11th June, they claimed, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed, that Ukraine, over the course of the day, that is to say 11th June, suffered losses, personnel losses, of 2,155 men. That's 2,155 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded in the area of the special military operation in direct fighting with the Russians. And today, 12th June, the losses, were slightly lower, were certainly lower. They were 1,835, but even that is a staggeringly high rate of loss by comparison with what we are seeing, what we have seen at any other point in the special military operation. Now, there have been moments, there have been periods in the past when the level of Ukrainian losses has spiked to similar levels. I remember that this happened, for example, during the fighting for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk during the early summer of 2022. And Ukraine suffered similar levels of losses during the fighting in Bakhmut last year. The Russians, by the way, also suffered heavy losses in the fighting in Bakhmut last year. I'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, the Ukrainians suffered very, very heavy losses then. And in particular, as I well remember, they started to suffer exceptionally heavy losses, very high losses. There was a spike in their losses. All of this, of course, comes from the Russian Defense Ministry. In the days and weeks after Bakhmut fell, when the local Ukrainian commander, General Syrsky, started to launch Ukraine's ultimately unsuccessful, in fact disastrously unsuccessful, counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area. And there were days over the course of that counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area, Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area, when Ukrainian losses also rose to over 2,000 men a day, as I remember. And, of course, during the summer counteroffensive that Ukraine launched last year, there were also days when Ukrainian losses were extremely high, though I don't actually, from memory, remember any single day when the losses were quite as high as this. The point is that we are not looking at the moment at a situation where either side is engaging in a general offensive. There is a horrific battle taking place in Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainian losses there are appalling. Yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry gave a list of urban areas and directions in central Donbas where they said that the losses, total losses in aggregate, came to around 700 men. And though they didn't specifically say so, Chasiv Yar clearly was one of those places. And I suspect that that is where the bulk of those losses took place. But we have nothing, no big offensive underway like the ones that the Russians launched towards Severodonetsk, Lysychansk in the early summer of 2022, or the ones that the Ukrainians launched in the autumn of 2022 in Kherson and Kharkiv region, or the offensive that the Ukrainians tried to launch last year over the course of the summer. What we have is a slogging match. The Russians pushing the Ukrainians right across the front line, gaining ground constantly. We'll come to that shortly. But we are not looking at the moment at a general Russian offensive. So, in a kind of a sense, this is more what you might call everyday type of fighting. But it is clear that, at least according to the Russians, Ukrainian losses nonetheless are spiking as the Russian bulldozer grinds forward. Now, of course, it's always possible, if you wish, to take issue with these numbers. These are Russian figures. The previous Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, reported to Putin, I remember several months ago, that the Russians are able to calculate Ukrainian casualty figures from radio intercepts, reports that the Ukrainian commanders themselves provide to Kiev and to their superiors of the losses that they have suffered. But that was what Shoigu said. We can't be certain that that is true. These are Russian accounts. I have to say that my sense overall is that the Russians are giving us roughly the correct figures, provided we understand that they're talking about dead and wounded, not about just dead, which was a misconception that I think many people had earlier in the war. So if one takes that as the starting point and looks at the state of the Ukrainian army and the desperate attempts Ukraine is making to try to mobilize soldiers to replace losses. One can, I think, see that the Ukrainian casualty rates are terrifyingly high and probably correspond roughly, not with exact accuracy, of course, to the estimates that the Russian Defense Ministry is giving us. That's my operative assumption. But even if I'm wrong about that, and even if the Russian figures are off by a bigger margin than I believe, well, it still has seemed to me that when the Russians start adding up casualties and reporting casualties of this level of intensity, it nonetheless gives us a very clear picture, a very good picture of the intensity of the fighting overall and of the places where the fighting is now becoming more intense. And it's clear that those places are the Bakhmut area, Chasiv Yar, Avdiivka area, Ocheretino, and other places around there. And interestingly and increasingly, the Kupiansk area, the northern front lines, which for many months up to the time of the fall of Avdiivka were relatively quiet. So that is where the fighting which is taking place is heaviest. And I think we can draw reasonably confident conclusions that in telling us this, the Russians are telling the truth. Now, I wanted to just deal quickly with the topic of Russian losses in Bakhmut, because Mediazona, which I consider, by the way, to be the most accurate independent source for Russian losses, has now given us numbers for Russian losses in the Battle of Bakhmut of 19,000. And I think that these figures are certainly accurate. They're based upon Mediazona's assessments of open source information, and I'm no doubt at all that Mediazona is analysing that information correctly. However, as Simplicius the thinker correctly points out, the fact that most people are not noticing about the numbers of Russian casualties is that a disproportionate number of them in the fighting in Bakhmut was made up of prisoners, of former convicts, whom Yevgeny Prigozhin, enticed into the battle by promising them pardons, and, as we now know, threw into the battle with minimal training. And if I've understood the Mediazona numbers correctly, and this does seem astonishing, out of that 19,000, 17,000 were convicts. Only 2,000 seem to have been regular Wagner fighters. Now, that is correct, and that gives us an idea, firstly, of the utter brutality and horror of the Battle of Bakhmut, but it also tells us something about the way in which Prigozhin chose to fight that battle, and it corresponds closely with what I recall were criticisms that were being made of Prigozhin at the time, that he'd, as I said, enticed large numbers of young men from Russian prisons to enlist and join the Wagner forces in return for pardons, and basically threw away their lives as part of his drive to capture Bakhmut as soon as possible. And I'm not saying that this was the primary reason why the relationship between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry collapsed, but I do remember that there were criticisms from regular Russian military that Prigozhin's attitude, his approach to these convicts, was unacceptable. And I also remember that in the late winter of 2023, In other words, some weeks before the battle for Bakhmut ended, the Russian authorities revoked Prigozhin's right to continue to recruit men from Russian prisons. Now, I would also add that I suspect that the figures from Bakhmut, the numbers of dead from Bakhmut, which, as I said, seem to include disproportionate numbers of prisoners, I think that they are instrumental in inflating the overall totals of Russian casualties, even within Mediazona's own calculations. Now, that is a controversial statement. I'm not going to argue the point in this program. I will just say that I think overall, since the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russians have brought down their casualty numbers to fully acceptable, at least by their standards, levels. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Ukraine cannot absorb losses on this scale over 1,500 men a day indefinitely, or even for very long. It is only a question of time before things start to break down. And we are getting reports that appear to confirm this. So the 79th Brigade, apparently an airborne unit, that has been defending on behalf of the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian positions in Novomikhailivka, in Paraskovyevka, in Konstantinovka, where there is now a battle underway. This is a village. These are villages to the south of Marinka and west of Kurakhovo. Anyway, the 79th Brigade are now apparently reporting on their website that after exceptionally heavy losses, some of their battalions are down to around 30% or even less strength, and that the brigade as a whole is down to around 40% strength and is close to reaching the point where it cannot continue fighting anymore. And the 79th Brigade is also complaining about the quality of the reinforcements it has been receiving from the Central Reserves in Ukraine, that the men who are turning up, the battalions that are turning up, are fundamentally, basically untrained. And there are reports that one particular independent battalion that was rushed to the front lines in Konstantinovka, Paraskovyevka, Novomikhailivka over the last few days, made up of essentially reservists, recently mobilized reservists. Well, they found the intensity of the fighting unbearable, and that the commanders of this battalion ultimately simply refused orders from the headquarters of the 79th Brigade and refused to carry out counterattacks or to hold positions which that they had been ordered to do. And supposedly there is now a fierce argument between the commanders of this battalion and the brigade headquarters of the 79th Brigade. And, well, today there are reports that no less a person than General Syrski, the overall military commander of Ukraine's forces, has rushed to this area, probably in an attempt, I'm guessing, to mediate the conflict, to resolve the conflict between these two military units in an essential part of the battlefronts. So that's one area where we're seeing military units exhausted, Ukrainian military units exhausted and breaking under the pressure. Now, as we will discuss shortly, the same is true in the absolutely key Avdiivka or Cheretino area, where the Russians are now making significant advances and the tempo of their advances is intensifying. But it is also turning out to be true in the Kharkiv area as well. Now, over the last week or so, the Ukrainians have been conducting a succession of counterattacks to try to push the Russians back from their positions close to the village of Lipsy and in the town of Volchansk. And there's been more comments about this from the group of forces north. Now, we have been receiving at the Duran a number of requests for information about the Telegram channel that I've been reading reports from, which is the Telegram channel that seems to be connected in some ways to Group of Forces North. Some people are asking where it can be found. First thing to say about this channel is that, of course, it is, rather this Telegram channel, is that, of course, it is in Russian. So if you want to find it, in English, the English name for it would be North Wind. But, of course, on the Telegram channel itself, its title in Russian is Severny Veter, which is North Wind in Russian. Now, I apologize to all Russian speakers for my probably poor pronunciation of its name. If you want to get summaries, English language summaries, and in fact sometimes complete translations of dispatches that appear on this Telegram channel, the best place to do it is Slavyangrad, another English language Telegram channel, clearly aligned with the Russians, but also, in my experience, a very, very good site aggregator. They regularly translate reports from this Telegram channel, Severny Veter, North Wind. And to repeat again, this is a completely different, it has a completely different quality to the reports that this channel, this North Wind channel, has completely different quality to the sort of reports we're getting from other Telegram channels or websites which are managed or connected in some way to military units Russian military units operating on the battlefronts, which use much more measured language and do not provide us with anything like the kind of vivid detail that North Wind does. In fact, for a while I was wondering whether North Wind, Severny Veter, really is connected to Group of Forces North, but I think as time has passed, it's become the unavoidable conclusion that it must be. There is no other explanation for how it obtains all this very detailed information about what Group of Forces North is doing on the battlefronts. I would give a warning, however, that there are other channels, Telegram channels, which claim to be connected to Group of Forces North. One of them apparently is called Severny Canal, North Canal. Please avoid them. None of them seem to have any connection to Group of Forces North. They're fakes, and I've seen it suggested that some of them at least might be run by the Ukrainians in order to spread confusion about what the actual situation with Group of Forces North actually is. Anyway, the point I'm coming back to is this. The Ukrainians have conducted a whole series of counterattacks over the last week or so in the Kharkiv area, according to Severny Veter, North Wind, in other words, according to Group of Forces North. Every one of these counterattacks has been repelled, has failed. The Russians are continuing their advances, but the point is that the Ukrainians have suffered very significant losses, and units like the 82nd Airborne Brigade, which previously, as I said, defended Belogorovka in Lugansk region, have suffered such severe losses over the course of these counterattacks that they've had to be withdrawn from the front lines. For the record, there is a new report from Group of Forces North on the Severny Veter Telegram channel, which provides a further update of the state of the fighting in Kharkiv region, and I will read it. On 11th June, the North Group of Forces continued the liberation of the border areas of Kharkiv region. In the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continued in the Volchansk settlement. Assault units of the North Group of Forces with heavy fighting are advancing in the area of the aggregate plant and have completely occupied another building. I'm assuming that this other building is the administrative building that they mentioned in their previous report, the report that they published yesterday. And the report then goes on to say advances are also being recorded in the east of the city. This is Volchansk. The total advance of the Russian troops in the Volchansk direction was up to 200 meters. And then they talk about the situation in Lipsy. In the Lipsy direction, in the morning, the enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, made another attempt to counterattack the positions of Group of Forces North in the area of the village of Glubokoye. The enemy lost more than 10 men killed and was thrown back to its initial positions. And then they go on to say that in the vicinity of Zelenoye, this is a village to the west of Lipsy, to the east of Lipsy, which the Group of Forces North have been approaching with a view to outflanking Ukrainian positions in Lipsy itself. Anyway, in the village of Lipsy, Group of Forces North advanced along the Murom River and are gaining ground on the dominant heights. So it looks like the village of Zelenoye is likely to fall fairly soon. And they say that in this area, in the Lipsy direction, the total advance of Russian troops amounted to 250 meters. And over the past 24 hours, enemy losses amounted to up to 240 men. And then there's a long list of artillery pieces Ukrainian artillery pieces that they say they've destroyed. And then they go on to say this: the Ukrainian grouping in Volchansk is experiencing serious supply problems. Remember what I said some weeks ago, that it seemed to some programs ago rather, that it seemed to me that the Ukrainian forces north of the Volcha River are effectively cut off. I said that they were trapped. Maybe I was overstating things, but that they seem to be cut off. Well, we're just being told by Group of Forces North that they're experiencing supply problems. And Group of Forces North goes on to say this: in order to remedy the situation, the enemy, that's the Ukrainians, once again attempted to make a crossing over the dam near Stary Saltov, which was again destroyed by our aviation. So the Ukrainians are trying to establish pontoon bridges and to find ways to cross the Volcha River to relieve their forces in northern Volchansk, but so far they've been unable to do so. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say, the movement of Ukrainian units to the area of concentration for the counteroffensive continues. The enemy tries to do this covertly to conceal the fact from our intelligence, given last year's experience, that's to say the experience of the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, and the shortage of Western equipment. Notice this. The enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, is unlikely to count on a lightning strike, but rather will use the tactic of, quote, meat assaults. In other words, they will not try to assemble large units of mechanized troops. They lack the armor and the armored vehicles to do that, to establish a punch. And when that was attempted last year during Ukraine's counteroffensive, it proved disastrous. So what we're going to get instead are light infantry attacks carried out in penny packets. That was what the Ukrainians did over the course of the Kherson counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022, as I very well remember. It is what the Ukrainians ended up doing during the summer counteroffensive last year. And according to Group of Forces North, it's likely what they're going to try and do in the Kharkiv area as well. And then the report ends. Group of Forces North are ready for all variants of events and will give battle to the enemy in any place and at any time. Victory will be ours. So as I said, definitely a personality here, unlike that provided by any other military unit. As I said, this must have been countenanced by the Russian command, obviously to unsettle the Ukrainians. But we see the general picture. Ukrainian counterattacks unsuccessful. Ukrainian losses in these counterattacks absolutely terrible. No ground gained. The overall situation continues to shape out to the Russian advantage. The Russians now close to capturing this village of Zelenoye. The Russians are gaining control of the dominant heights and advancing along the Murom River. I'm not sure where that is. But anyway, it all looks to be connected with the Battle of Zelenoye. The Russians gradually gaining control in Volchansk of the aggregate plant, advancing through other parts of Volchansk, weakening the Ukrainian forces there, the hold of the Ukrainian forces overall. The Ukrainians effectively cut off in northern Volchansk, and the Russians, according to these reports, confident of victory, appearing to have, as they believe, the situation fully under control. Anyway, that's Group of Forces North. We still have this enigma about what the Russians are trying to do in Sumy region. It's not clear to me whether they still occupy that village that they occupied on the border of Sumy region, or whether it was just a raid with Chechen and Wagner forces going in, raising a Russian flag and pulling out again. There's deep fog of war over many parts of the battlefronts. But Kharkiv region turning into another bloodbath, another cemetery for large parts of the Ukrainian army. And, well, let's now move to where the fighting is most intense. We have less information today about what is going on in the Chasiv Yar area. This is very standard. We don't always get reports every day about Russian progress there, but that doesn't mean that Russian progress isn't happening. But we are getting lots of reports now from the Ocheretino Avdiivka area. And the first thing to say is that it now seems definitely the case that the Russians are indeed in control, have indeed fully captured the key village of Novo Alexandrovka, northwest of Ocheretino. And there are reports that the Russians have now pushed northward, some distance beyond Novo-Alexandrovka. There's a small lake, looks like a lake, northwest of Novo-Alexandrovka. The Russians have skirted that lake. They've reached what is apparently a dam at the very northern tip of this lake. They are now very close, it seems, to another village, Vozdvizhenka, which presumably is their next target. And a short distance further away is the road between Pokrovsk, which runs from Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, all the way to Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar, and which is apparently the main Ukrainian supply line in central Donbas. So the Russians now within striking distance of that road and pushing forward towards Vozdvizhenka, the next village, in fact the last village before they finally reach the road. Now, the key thing is that the report we heard yesterday, that an entire battalion of Ukrainian troops charged with defending Novo-Alexandrovka broke and fled, appears to be correct. Again, one doesn't have exact information about all of this, but it is likely true. I come back to my earlier point that the Ukrainian army simply cannot sustain the level of losses that the Russians are reporting. And just as was the case in the area of Novomikhailovka, Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka in the south, where the 79th Brigade is complaining that the battalion that came to support them is not carrying out orders and is retreating and is refusing to carry out the attacks that it's ordered to undertake. Well, it looks as if Ukrainian troops in the Novo-Alexandrovka area have again broken and they have fled. Now, we've had this situation happen repeatedly over the last few weeks. There was a cluster of incidents where Ukrainian troops broke and abandoned their defense lines in the Avdiivka area around the time when Avdiivka fell. And this epidemic of disobedience and refusal to fight began to spread to other brigades in other places. We saw things like that happen, for example, in Chasiv Yar, in the Chasiv Yar area, where the Ukrainian unit, important Ukrainian unit, based on the right sector organization, refusing to hold its positions east of Chasiv Yar, retreating without orders, allowing the Russians to reach the area of the micro-district, which has been the subject of the recent fighting. We've also seen the Azov Brigade, which, by the way, is now going to be the recipient of American military aid. Military equipment is going to be provided to them directly from the United States. I think that they've been already using American military equipment for a long time, just to say. But anyway, it's now officially confirmed that they will, despite their political beliefs, if I can put it like that, have access to that kind of equipment on an official basis. Anyway, the 3rd Azov Brigade proved a law unto itself. They refused to go to the rescue of the garrison in Avdiivka. They retreated from various positions in the villages to the west of Avdiivka. They were very reluctant to fight in Krasnogorovka. They were unwilling to fight in Chasiv Yar. When they do fight, they remain a formidable force, but they become increasingly skeptical and willful when it comes to orders that they receive from the higher command. Well, those are elite brigades, but we see that elsewhere now, along the front lines, it looks as if Ukrainian soldiers are increasingly making their own decisions and are refusing to stand and fight in places where they think that doing so is simply, it would simply amount to suicide. And it's not just Novo-Alexandrovka. There's been lots of reports of other Ukrainian units retreating in a disorganized way in this entire territory west of Ocheretino. There's reports, for example, that the Russians have now captured the village of Sokol, that they're about to attack another village called Yevgenivka, which lies immediately to the west of Sokol, that the Russians have captured most of another village called Novopokrovske, which lies to the southwest of Ocheretino, and that they're very close to attacking yet another village, Novoselivka Persha. These are all very small places. Novoselivka Persha, before the war, had a population of less than 1,000. But they were key places in the defense line that Ukraine was trying to cobble together in this area. And there are reports that Ukrainian troops are retreating en masse, sometimes after token resistance, in the face of Russian advances. The Russian advance west of Avdiivka and Ocheretino looks unstoppable. To a great extent, I suspect that what is holding the Russians back in this area is not so much Ukrainian resistance as the concern of the Russians not to advance beyond their own logistical supplies. In other words, not to move too fast so that they are not properly supplied with the equipment, the ammunition, and all of the rest that they need in order to keep advancing. So, a situation in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area, which again highlights the immense damage that the Ukrainian military is suffering and the effect that this is having on the Ukrainian army's ability to hold the line. And of course, it isn't just there. We've discussed various parts of the battlefronts. There's other things going on in other parts of the front lines as well, in Krasnogorovka, in the Vremevka salient area as well, where there are reports that the Russians are now mopping up Orozhaine, the next village after Staromayorsk. But the key point to make always is that the attrition that the Ukrainians are suffering from is becoming relentless, and that they have no real response to it. They're not able to slow the process down, and with every day that passes, the losses mount, their ability to keep resisting declines, and the Russians become stronger. And we've had a recent report from, of all places, Rheinmetall, the German industrial group, which has played a significant role in maintaining, in supplying German military equipment, shells and such things, to Ukraine. And Rheinmetall says that Ukraine has enough weaponry to keep going for a maximum of 6 months to a year. The quantity of military material Ukraine is receiving from the West continues to decline. Rheinmetall says that this is due to budget constraints. I've already pushed back on that many times, as has Brian Beletic at the new Atlas. And in fact, we see this on the battlefronts, that Ukraine is now very short of armoured vehicles, increasingly short of tanks. Apparently, the Leopard 1 saga turned out to be a disaster. Most of the Leopard 1s that were supplied to Ukraine were simply unfit for purpose. They had to be hugely refurbished at the end of what will probably be a long and very complicated process. Ukraine will end up with a large number of Leopard 1s, which are not capable of taking on the far more heavily gunned and far more powerfully gunned and heavily armoured Russian tanks that are now spreading across the battlefronts. So we can see why Vladimir Putin and his top military commanders might be having a council of war at this time. They have a lot to consider. They have to consider the various actions that the West might take. The fact that the Western powers have authorized Ukraine, as they like to put it, to carry out cross-border strikes into Russian territory. And of course that has happened, though the extent to which that's had any effect, well, it's not obvious to me that it's made any difference at all. They have to also consider what Ukraine might do in other places, in Crimea. Last night, the Russian Defense Ministry says that there was another big Ukrainian missile strike at Crimea. 9 ATACMS missiles were launched towards Crimea. A couple of days ago, the Ukrainians were claiming that there were no air defenses, no operating Russian air defenses in Crimea. The Russians say that they shot down all of those 9 ATACMS missiles. So clearly, there are still air defenses, Russian air defenses in Crimea. So the Russians obviously have to take all of that into account as well. But it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the real reason why this Council of War, because that's what it looks like, has taken place in Russia with Putin's personal participation, is because the Russians are sensing that Ukraine is weakening, and well, perhaps it's not yet ready to break, but that it might be a moment for the Russians to intensify still more their own operations, that perhaps things are happening ahead of the Russian clock, ahead of the Russian timetable. To the best of our knowledge, the Russians appear to have had a plan to end the war by some point in 2025, but with the situation on the battlefronts being what it is, it might be that the Russians have now concluded that it's not necessary for them to wait that long, that the moment might be coming closer for them to deal what could be the knockout punch. After all, Putin himself said at SPIEF that at the SPIEF conference in St. Petersburg, that the situation might arise where it might actually become sensible for the Russians to start to increase the tempo, to hurry, as he put it, to advance more quickly. And of course, it's not just on the ground that the Russians are working. last night, they also carried out a big missile strike. It seems it was principally focused on Kiev. And this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with some information as to what that was all about. This morning, the armed forces, I'm reading from their report, this morning the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a group strike by long-range air and ground-based high-precision weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles at flight lines and infrastructure of the Ukrainian Air Force Base, as well as one temporary deployment area of foreign mercenaries, preparation sites of uncrewed surface vehicles, ammunition and explosive depots. All the assigned targets have been engaged. So that was a strike carried out using Iskander-M ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and uranium-2 drones. And as I said, the focus was Kiev. We're told that an airbase was one place where the Russians concentrated, that they were attacking the flight lines and infrastructure of the Ukrainian Air Force. In other words, they're attacking the air bases from which the F-16s are expected to operate. And they're also attacking deployment positions, preparation sites for uncrewed surface vehicles. There was a strike on Odessa, and it looks like the Russians targeted a location from which Ukraine intends to launch its water drones into the Black Sea. And the Russians also attacked ammunition and explosive depots. It doesn't seem as if there was any attack yesterday on the Ukrainian energy system, but the Ukrainians themselves are saying that it is now in a catastrophic condition. There's an article in the Kiev Independent which says that amongst the various potential scenarios in terms of the energy situation in Ukraine, the worst one is the most likely, or one of the most likely, with the possibility that Ukrainians might face blackouts, electricity blackouts, during the winter of up to 20 hours a day. 20 hours a day. And of course, we don't know what further attacks on the remaining fragments of the energy system the Russians have in mind. I read somewhere, and I believe this comes from a Ukrainian source, that the Ukrainian energy system, at the time when Ukraine achieved its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, had a capacity of 55 million gigawatts, and that this has now fallen to 9 million gigawatts. That seems an astonishing reduction, most of which I suspect is the result of the war, the capture by the Russians of Ukrainian energy stations, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and other power stations, but also, of course, the massive destruction of the component parts of Ukraine's energy system. Well, all of that tells us again how desperate Ukraine's situation has become. And so, well, we'll just have to see what the outcome of this Council of War in Russia is going to be, whether the Russians do indeed plan to hurry things along, to intensify their offensive. It's plausible, but of course, as I always have to say, the Russian military leadership and the Kremlin do not share their secrets with me. So I can only guess what the Russians are intending to do, but I don't know. I don't know for a fact. Now, even as the situation in Ukraine approaches, it's not quite there, but it's steadily approaching a point of potential collapse. By the way, on that, I saw some claims this morning that the number of people who are crossing the borders to escape Ukraine is increasing. And I saw that there was one report which claimed that a party of Ukrainians who fled to Hungary to avoid mobilization included police officers and security service personnel from the SBU, which would be a very ominous sign for Ukraine if that was so. I read also, by the way, a report from a resident, I think it was resident, one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, which claimed that contrary to some claims made by some Ukrainian officials, the mobilization drive in Ukraine, which is causing such enormous social tension within the country, that is running far behind schedule, that Ukraine is not recruiting the numbers of men that it is seeking to recruit. Well, again, how am I supposed to know one way or the other? But that it is causing rising social tensions within Ukraine, I think that is indisputable. And it appears to be intensifying a mood of war weariness and anger with it across the population. Well, even as that is going on, even as all the signs are of a country that is careering towards a collapse, talk of negotiations, both by the Ukrainian government and by key Western governments, are nowhere to be heard. President Zelensky himself has been on a visit to Germany, where he's met all sorts of dignitaries like Chancellor Scholz, obviously Annalena Baerbock, and other members of the government, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, all his dearest supporters and best friends, in other words. Anyway, he met all of these. He also addressed the Bundestag, the German parliament. The address was boycotted by the AfD and by Sarah Wagenknecht's party. In other words, the two parties that gained the most ground in the German part of the European Parliament elections boycotted Zelensky's speech. But anyway, he made all the same claims, all the same points that he's made many times before, that negotiations with the Russians on anything other than his peace plan are unacceptable, that the Russians must withdraw completely from all of Ukraine, that Ukraine must retake all of its territory, that the Russians, in other words, must be comprehensively defeated and must lose the war. And, well, he was applauded for saying all of these things. I haven't actually watched what happened in the Bundestag, but I believe that the mainstream parties, the CDU, CSU, the SPD, the Greens, all of them, they gave Zelensky a standing ovation, even as he retreated into what looks to me total unreality. And of course, in a few days' time, the conference in Lucerne is supposed to begin. This is the Swiss Peace Conference, which, as Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, has correctly pointed out, doesn't look as if it was really organised by the Swiss at all. It looks as if it was Zelensky's office that was sending out the invitations and trying to persuade countries to attend that peace conference. Anyway, the peace conference is about to begin, and with more and more countries perhaps becoming increasingly aware of the real situation in Ukraine. After all, many countries around the world have embassies in Kiev. Their diplomats will be well informed about the situation. They will be aware of the tensions within the Ukrainian government, highlighted by that FT article that I discussed yesterday. They will also have a sense of the situation on the battlefronts, and of course the Russians are probably keeping lots of governments advised. Anyway, it seems that even governments that had previously indicated that they were minded to attend this so-called peace conference are now thinking anew and might be preparing to pull out. According to Radio Liberty, the number of participating countries is now likely to drop from 93, who had initially intended to accept invitations, to just 78. So a whole group of countries, cluster of countries, is apparently now rethinking their participation in the conference. And in what looks like a desperate attempt to try to stem this pull-out of countries from the Lucerne conference, we're now getting reports that the conference is not actually going to endorse Zelensky's peace plan after all. It's going to moderate itself to talking about such things as humanitarian relief and that sort of thing, and that it won't even call for a withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. This conference has turned out to be a disaster. Perhaps some of the countries that are choosing not to attend are starting to have doubts about Zelensky's longevity as president of Ukraine, given all the doubts that the Russians are busy feeding about Zelensky's legitimacy. Who's to say? But it looks as if we are looking at the gradually shrinking non-peace conference. This conference was a stupid idea from the start. I don't know who came up with it. It was bound to fail. It was presumably hatched as some kind of attempt to bolster Zelensky's position after the failure of last summer's counteroffensive and following the decision, which the Americans must have green-lighted, to cancel the presidential elections in March. But with every day, as the situation in Ukraine deteriorates and as question marks over Zelensky's position increase in number, it seems as if more and more countries are quietly deciding that they should stay away. Anyway, there we are. That's the peace conference. That was Zelensky's visit to Germany. The determination of the German political class in the face of opposition, the opposition of much of their public to go on supporting Ukraine, remains to me astonishing. We had a report about a week ago that Europe only has 5% of the air defense systems that it needs. There's been much talk about how in recent weeks Olaf Scholz's government has been trying to pressure other European governments to supply Ukraine with more air defense systems. In the end, all that Scholz could come up with over the course of Zelensky's visit is one more German Patriot system. I suspect it's probably Germany's last, just guessing now, and another IRIS-T system, is one of the new German air defense systems which has been supplied to Ukraine and which is apparently only a spotty record on the battlefronts. There are reports that the United States is also planning to supply Ukraine with another Patriot system. The United States was very unwilling, the Pentagon was very unwilling to part with its Patriot systems because these are also relatively few in number, given the international commitments of the United States, and the Patriot is considered an essential system for countering Chinese air power in the Pacific. But the Americans, disappointed with the inability or refusal of the Europeans to make up the numbers in terms of air defense systems, have apparently decided nonetheless to supply one of their own. But anyway, more weapon systems are being shipped to Ukraine to be destroyed probably by the Russians. I discussed yesterday the plans over the F-16s. The overall military strength of NATO continues to decline. It's a fact, even though it's one that few people want to discuss. And even as NATO, or at least some people within NATO, threaten intervention, and of course the West European public, especially the West European public, seems increasingly hostile to this whole idea of intervention. And, well, we've had now further news from France. We saw how in the French part of the European Parliament elections, Marine Le Pen's party swept the board, and her party emerged as the clear-cut winner in the elections, winning double the number of votes of President Macron's party, which crashed to 15% of the vote. President Macron has gambled by calling parliamentary elections in France. His big pitch, echoing policies of French leaders of the past, of Jacques Chirac, for example, and of Macron himself, to pose as the defender of democracy and of the constitutional system against the threat of the far right, the supposedly anti-democratic far right represented by Marine Le Pen, one which has been very successful in the past in France. Anyway, it seems that was his tactic in this election. He said to himself, in calling this election, he said to himself, well, for all her gains in the European Parliament elections, Marine Le Pen's party only won 33% of the vote. That must mean that 67% of the French electorate voted for other parties. By reducing the vote to the question of either me or the anti-democratic far right, Macron perhaps hoped to win back a majority. And he's talked about creating a coalition of parties across the political scene in France, a coalition of parties, an alliance of parties behind his own to see off the far right. But it's starting to look as if he's miscalculated, because within the political class, as well as within the wider electorate, something which Macron perhaps failed to understand, his reputation has become toxic. He is deeply unpopular. He's not just unpopular in the way that his predecessor, Francois Hollande, had become unpopular. He is actively loathed by a very, very large number of people, proportion of the population of France. And I understand that the leaders of the various parliamentary parties, other than Le Pen's, who were not consulted by Macron over his decision to call these elections, are absolutely furious with Macron for calling the elections in the way that he did, without informing them in advance or seeking their advice or giving them the necessary amount of time in which to organize. And this fury is starting to translate into actual consequences. So there is an article today in the Financial Times, and it reads, French parties reject Macron's offer for alliance against far-right. Socialists, Greens and Les Républicains, the last being the mainstream right in France, what was the mainstream right, say pat with President's party ahead of snap poll is out of the question. France's mainstream parties have rejected an offer by President Macron to form an alliance ahead of snap elections in a bid to halt the rise of Marine Le Pen's far right. Macron made the shock move to dissolve the National Assembly on Sunday night after his centrist alliance suffered a bruising defeat in European Parliament elections by Le Pen's Rassemblement National. He justified the high-stakes gamble as being necessary for voters to set a clear direction for the country and end the parliamentary gridlock in place since his centrist alliance lost its majority in 2022. With little time before the first round of voting on June 30th, Macron made his public pitch to centre-left parties such as the Socialists and the Greens, as well as the centre-right Les Républicains, on Sunday night. But his potential allies have so far rejected his offer. Le Républicain leader Eric Ciotti said it was out of the question to enter into a coalition with those who have so damaged France. And we read others apparently taking exactly the same view, and it looks as if Macron's party is likely to be left facing Le Pen's by itself, in which case the possibility of Le Pen's party emerging as the dominant party in the French National Assembly as a result of these elections is going to increase significantly. Again, it's, I think, difficult for political leaders like Macron to understand the extent of the disillusion and hostility to them that exists amongst their wider electorates. This pattern is repeating itself right across the West. It is a factor in the American election. It is an even bigger factor in the British general election, which is currently underway. The winner of that election is certain to be Keir Starmer's Labour Party, which is as mainstream as it gets. The governing party, the Conservative Party, everybody sees appears to be crashing towards an almost apocalyptic, perhaps even terminal defeat. The attempt to freeze out alternatives on the right and left might have miscarried. It looks as if the Reform Party now effectively led by Nigel Farage, appears to be growing in strength. Anyway, there is clear hostility across Britain to the political class, and we still have several weeks of the election to go. But of course, in Europe, this process has gone further. We've seen elections in Germany, in Austria, in France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. In Belgium, there were both European Parliament elections and national elections, and the governing party of the Prime Minister fell to, I believe, 5% of the vote, forcing the Prime Minister himself to resign. Well, we see a general repudiation right across the political spectrum in the West of the governing class. And it seems as if that governing class still cannot understand that it is their Ukrainian policy which is driving this opposition to a great degree. Both the militaristic language that they're engaging in, which is remote from the concerns of their voters and alarming for many of them, especially, I suspect, in France, but also because their voters probably at some level understand that the current economic malaise is indeed connected with the Ukrainian policy. And anyway, that economic malaise by itself, which is in large part a product of their Ukrainian policy, would by itself suffice to turn a lot of their voters against them. But nonetheless, they carry on. They carry on exactly the same way that they always have. Ukraine continues to be the obsession, the fixation, or perhaps not so much Ukraine, but rather Russia. The need to defeat Russia, to push Russia further away from Europe, to destroy the government of President Putin in Moscow, perhaps to engineer the country's breakup. There's an alarming number of people talking in this way now. All of this, that remains the obsession, even though it's clear that it is not an obsession which is shared by the people, not just of Europe, but of the West as a whole. I have never known a time in my lifetime when the obsessions, the priorities of the political class are so distant from those of the people who supposedly elect them. Anyway, the big question remains, what will happen when everything does eventually fall apart in Ukraine? Because whatever all the various schemes try to achieve, the dispatch of the ATACMS missiles, we see that's changed nothing on the battlefronts. The appearance of the F-16s, I predict the same. All the talk of military deployments in Ukraine, if they ever happen, they're only going to inflame the situation in Europe even more. Well, all of that, if all of that is been tried and hasn't succeeded, nothing can succeed. What the effect is going to be when the collapse in Ukraine comes, that I don't want to speculate about on this program, but I suspect that the consequences will be very grave and perhaps also unpredictable in terms of what happens in the West. Now, I'm going to finish this program with a brief discussion of another, in my opinion, harebrained plan. This is about another war being planned in another place. This is the war that some people in the United States seem all too eager to pursue, which is against China over Taiwan. And a couple of days ago, we had comments by a US Admiral, Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, who told the Washington Post that the United States has plans to employ thousands of drones, presumably sea drones and aerial drones and every kind of drone, if China launches, as he puts it, a military attack on Taiwan. Now, so far as we're aware, there is no defense treaty between the United States and Taiwan. I suspect, by the way, that there probably is. President Biden has hinted that there is. But of course it is secret, because such a security agreement between the United States and Taiwan would have been agreed in direct contravention of promises made back in the 1970s by the United States to China to basically end its military relationship with Taiwan as part of the US's recognition of China as a single country, of which Taiwan is a province, with the government in Beijing being the government of the whole country. But anyway, despite that, despite the fact that, as I said, to the best of our knowledge, there is no security treaty between the United States and Taiwan, it's now increasingly clear that the United States intends to defend Taiwan once Taiwan declares independence, for which it's clear that that is the ultimate intention. And, well, we now have this plan to flood the air and the sea around Taiwan with drones to try to deter or defeat the Chinese military. And Admiral Paparo called this plan the creation of a hellscape. Now, it may surprise Americans to know that these comments of Admiral Paparo have been widely reported in China and have attracted a great deal of commentary in the Chinese media, and I believe even more on the Chinese on Chinese social media platforms. And it might surprise Admiral Paparo and others in the United States that the Chinese, the general consensus in China appears to be that this so-called plan, which may not be a real plan at all, is actually a confession of weakness. It is an admission by the US Navy that its surface ships cannot operate safely close to Chinese territory. That if they try to deploy close to Taiwan, they would be overwhelmed by hypersonic missile strikes from Chinese territory. Now, the Chinese seem to be generally unimpressed by this hellscape plan. They say that this is an article in Global Times, that it is just wishful thinking. The United States, this is again from Global Times, has the most advanced military technology and the largest fleet of military drones in the world. I wonder whether that is actually even true anymore. I would have thought the largest fleet of military drones in the world is now Russia's. Just saying. But anyway, let's continue. and the overall military strength of the United States is superior to that of the People's Liberation Army. Nonetheless, the US advantages in the Taiwan Straits cannot be fully brought into play. If the United States sends its aircraft carriers to the region, the People's Liberation Army can use its anti-ship ballistic missiles to keep US aircraft carriers out of the first island chain. The US needs command platforms to command its thousands of unmanned weapons. The People's Liberation Army has the ability to pin down these platforms and to jam their signals. Now, is this true? Are the Chinese bluffing? I don't think the Chinese bluff. I don't think that they're impressed by this threat. I think, as I have said, that they interpret it as a sign of weakness. In fact, I've no doubt that that is what they see it as. Put all that aside, is it really in the US's interests to get dragged into a war with China over Taiwan? Why not just leave the situation alone? Why not respect the status quo? Recognize that Taiwan is a part of China, inform the Taiwanese publicly and privately that if they were to go for outright secession, the United States would not support them, and that in that case, if the Chinese took military action against Taiwan, the United States could not be involved, it could not interfere in a Chinese operation to bring back under control what is, according to the US's official position, a Chinese province. Why not do that? Probably that would calm the situation significantly in Taiwan. After all, Taiwan has a very wide degree of independence, internal independence anyway. There's no sign that the Chinese themselves are seeking at the moment a military conquest of Taiwan. They are, as they have repeatedly said, responding to what they see as provocations coming from the Taiwanese and American side. It's not the Chinese who are driving this crisis, it is the Americans and the Taiwanese. So, why not leave this situation alone? Why not tell China, look, we don't want a conflict in Taiwan, you don't want a conflict in Taiwan, this is what we've told the Taiwanese. If you leave the Taiwanese alone, we can just go on trading as we always have, and any problems between you and Taiwan are for you to sort out. Why not do that? As I said, most likely in that case, Taiwan would drop its plans for secession, or rather, to be more precise, the plans of some Taiwanese politicians for secession. China would be content with the status quo because the status quo has worked very well for China over the last couple of decades, and the United States would be free, would be able to avoid another war in the Pacific, which surely it is in its interests to do. Well, no, we now come up with plans for vast fleets of aerial and water drones, which for the moment, by the way, don't exist. We will see where all this goes. The omens look very bad. One would have thought that one defeat in Ukraine was enough, but it looks like we must embrace yet another defeat in the Pacific, where the stakes are going to be higher still. I wonder at what point we finally stop. This is where I end my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our video. You can find all our programmes. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find there all kinds of amazing things, including our new Football 24 series. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day.